He came to learn, but I got lost in his eyes. What started as a lesson turned into something neither of us expected. The first time I saw her, I wasn't sure whether I came to learn or to get completely distracted. The classroom smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a combination that made me feel both alert and oddly calm. My notebook was open, my pen poised, yet I found my gaze drifting toward her, the way she moved as she arranged the chairs, the effortless grace in each gesture. There was something quietly magnetic about her presence, something that made the mundane act of taking a seat suddenly feel charged with possibility. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. She didn't notice me staring, or at least, she didn't react. She smiled at a student across the room, a soft, knowing smile that somehow made the air warmer. I tried to focus on the syllabus, on the reason I was here, but my eyes kept returning to the subtle tilt of her head, the way sunlight caught strands of hair that had escaped her bun. Everything about her radiated calm confidence, but beneath it, I sensed a quiet vulnerability. A tension I couldn't name yet felt drawn to. Our first exchange was brief, seemingly mundane. She adjusted my posture during an exercise, her hand brushing my shoulder. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a strange warmth through me, a pulse that lingered longer than it should have. She looked at me then, her eyes briefly meeting mine, and in that instant, I caught a glimmer of curiosity, maybe even recognition. It was enough to make me forget the words I was supposed to be writing, the lesson I came to learn. Throughout the session, I noticed the little details that made her, her. The faint scent of jasmine that lingered as she moved past me, the subtle way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, the gentleness in her corrections, never condescending, always patient. And yet, there was a quiet energy beneath it all, an awareness in her eyes that seemed to look deeper than the surface, as if she could see the parts of me I didn't yet understand myself. By the end of the class, I realized that I had learned far more than the subject of the day. I had learned about attention, about the way someone can occupy a space and a mind without even trying. I had learned about subtle tension, about how one fleeting touch or glance could ripple through a person in unexpected ways. And though I tried to leave composed, I walked out with a strange, unsteady anticipation, wondering when, or if, I would find myself in her orbit again. This first encounter sets the stage, a young man drawn in by the quiet, graceful confidence of an older woman. Their connection is immediate yet tentative, wrapped in subtle glances and fleeting touches. The audience should feel both the intrigue of possibility and the tension of restraint, knowing this is only the beginning of something deeper, something that will grow slowly, tenderly, over time. The days after that first class felt strangely electric, though nothing had changed outwardly. I still came to learn, still carried my notebook, still tried to focus on the lessons she was teaching. But every movement she made, every subtle expression, seemed amplified in my mind. The rustle of her skirt as she shifted in her chair, the soft cadence of her voice when explaining a concept, even the delicate tapping of her pen, it all seemed orchestrated to pull me in closer, though I knew it wasn't intentional. One afternoon, we were working on an exercise together, standing side by side at a low table. I reached for a pen at the same moment she did, our hands brushing lightly. The warmth from that brief contact lingered far longer than it should have, a subtle spark that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. She looked at me then, eyes slightly wider than usual, and a small, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. My own smile felt awkward though genuine, because suddenly the lesson I had come to absorb felt secondary. We lingered in that position longer than necessary, moving papers back and forth, adjusting angles, sharing notes. Her shoulder occasionally nudged mine as she leaned over to see the work more clearly, and each touch, however small, felt charged with unspoken meaning. I found myself studying the way her fingers moved, the quiet grace in her gestures, and the way her gaze occasionally met mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. It wasn't just physical proximity. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet warmth she radiated, the subtle attention she gave to every detail. I realized that this was new for me, feeling so aware of someone else's presence, noticing the smallest nuances, and feeling both exhilaration and restraint at the same time. And yet, she never acted inappropriately. Every touch, every glance, remained entirely natural, entirely innocent, yet undeniably intimate. There was a moment when she handed me a book, and our fingers brushed again. This time, I didn't pull away immediately. I let the brief contact linger, savoring the warmth, the subtle electricity between us. She didn't comment, didn't flinch. Instead, she met my eyes, and in that shared look, something shifted. An unspoken acknowledgement that this connection, delicate, tentative, entirely human, was real. Later, as the class ended, we walked out together. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm golden glow over everything. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, and I felt a quiet contentment in the simple rhythm of walking beside her. I wanted to say something, anything, that might capture the strange, unspoken tension between us, but I held back, letting the silence carry its own weight. By the time I left that day, I realized that the lesson I had come for was no longer about the subject matter at all. It was about her, about learning the subtleties of presence, touch, and connection. And though either of us had said a word about what was happening between us, I knew, deep down, that the gentle closeness we had shared that afternoon had changed everything. The next week, I found myself lingering after class, pretending to organize my notes, while secretly hoping she would stay a little longer too. The room was quieter now. The bustle of students had thinned, leaving only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of lavender she always carried. She was collecting her things slowly, and I realized I had no idea what I was going to say, if anything at all. Yet I couldn't leave, not yet. "Do you want to sit for a few minutes?" she asked suddenly, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat, and I nodded, following her to a small corner of the room where two chairs faced each other. There was no rush, no expectation, just a quiet space between us. She settled into her chair with that effortless grace that had captivated me from the beginning, crossing her legs and resting her hands lightly in her lap. I noticed, as always, the way her presence seemed to fill the space without trying. We started talking about the lesson, but the conversation naturally drifted. She spoke about her experiences, the challenges she had faced in her own life, the small triumphs that had shaped her confidence. There was no pretension, only honesty, a warmth in her voice that made it easy to listen, easy to lean in. I found myself sharing a little too, stories I rarely told anyone, thoughts I had tucked away even from myself. There was something about her gaze, steady yet soft, that invited vulnerability without pressuring it. At one point I noticed my hand inching closer to hers on the armrest. She didn't flinch, instead she let it hover, a quiet acknowledgement of the comfort we found in each other's presence. My fingers brushed hers lightly, and I felt a shiver of warmth, not of desire, but of connection. It was a small, electric moment, an understanding without words. She laughed softly at one of my stories, a sound that made my chest feel impossibly light. For a moment, time slowed, and I became acutely aware of the subtle intimacy in the air, the way her hair fell slightly over her shoulder, the tilt of her head as she listened, the occasional shift in her posture that brought her subtly closer to me. It wasn't dramatic or overt, it was human, warm, and tender. As our conversation wound down, I realized that this moment, more than any brush of a hand or lingering glance, had deepened the bond between us. We had shared pieces of ourselves we usually kept hidden, and in doing so, we had built a quiet trust. A connection that didn't rely on grand gestures, but on the gentle rhythm of understanding and attentiveness. Walking out together afterward, the world seemed softer somehow, the air richer, the golden light of late afternoon bathing everything in warmth. I felt a profound sense of anticipation, not for what might happen next, but for the continued unfolding of this slow, delicate intimacy. And in her presence, I understood that sometimes the most meaningful connections are formed not in leaps, but in the gentle, patient unfolding of trust, attention, and shared vulnerability. It was a rainy afternoon when our world seemed to narrow into the small corner of her studio where we often met. Outside, the rain tapped a soft rhythm against the windows, a gentle percussion that seemed to hush the rest of the world. The lesson had ended, but neither of us moved to leave. We lingered, a quiet mutual hesitation keeping us in the same space, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. She handed me a book for reference, and as I reached for it, our fingers brushed again. This time, I didn't immediately pull back. The warmth of her skin, the faint pressure of her fingertips, sent a ripple through me, subtle but undeniable. She looked up, eyes locking with mine, and for a moment the lesson, the world outside, all of it fell away. It was just us, suspended in a fragile, unspoken understanding. I found myself acutely aware of every small detail. The soft scent of jasmine in her hair, the quiet tilt of her head, the way her eyes held a gentle intensity as they searched mine. She leaned slightly closer to point out a passage in the book, and our shoulders brushed, closer this time, the contact lingering longer than either of us expected. My chest tightened, and I realized with startling clarity that this was no longer just admiration or curiosity. Something deeper, more profound, had taken root between us. The silence stretched, comforting yet charged. She spoke, her voice soft and deliberate, about a section of the text we were reviewing. But even as she spoke, it wasn't her words that occupied my attention. It was her presence, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her, the quiet steadiness that anchored me even as it made my pulse quicken. My fingers twitched, wanting to reach for hers again, but unsure if such a gesture was welcome. Then, almost instinctively, our hands met once more, this time intentionally but still gentle, deliberate. Her hand rested lightly against mine, and I could feel the subtle warmth, the quiet reassurance, the fleeting pulse of connection that needed no words. The moment stretched, a delicate balance between restraint and desire, between what was appropriate and what felt inevitable. It was intoxicating yet tender, a perfect embodiment of slow-burning intimacy. Finally she spoke, her tone almost a whisper. "You seem different today." I could only manage a small, nervous smile. My heart raced, but in her gaze I felt seen, truly seen, and for the first time, I sensed that perhaps she had felt it too, the pull of closeness, the quiet tension that had been building between us. As the rain drummed softly outside, we stayed there a while longer, hands barely touching, shoulders brushing, eyes meeting and lingering in ways that neither of us could articulate but both understood. It was a fleeting moment of connection, delicate yet profound, an unspoken acknowledgement that our bond had shifted. From this point forward, nothing would be quite the same. After that rainy afternoon, the tension between us had shifted. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it lingered like the faint scent of jasmine she carried, subtle, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about her at odd moments, while flipping through my notes, walking down the street, or pausing by a cafe window to watch the world move past. She had become both a lesson I was learning from and an emotion I was unraveling, and the combination was dizzying. One evening, she asked me to stay after class again, this time under the pretense of reviewing something in my work. The room was quiet. The hum of the city outside barely penetrated the soft warmth of the studio. We sat across from each other at a small table, the distance between us suddenly feeling too great. I wanted to bridge it, to let her know that the pull I felt toward her was no fleeting curiosity. And in that silence, the courage to speak finally rose within me. I think I've been distracted," I admitted, my voice almost catching on the words. She tilted her head, a faint, amused curiosity in her eyes, but there was no judgment, only attentiveness. "Not by the lessons," I continued, forcing a nervous laugh, "but by you." The confession felt both terrifying and liberating, a tremor running through me that I couldn't suppress. Her eyes softened, the subtle intensity of our previous encounters reflected in their warmth. "I wondered when you would say something," she said quietly, and in that instant, I realized that the unspoken tension had been mutual all along. The vulnerability in her voice matched my own. We were no longer merely student and teacher, observer and observed. We were two people navigating an unexpected connection, fragile yet profound. I noticed how close she was sitting, the faint brush of her hand against mine as she adjusted a notebook. Each subtle touch carried weight now, a reaffirmation of the intimacy we were cautiously embracing. My pulse quickened, not from desire, but from the recognition of mutual understanding. For a moment, it was as if the room had narrowed to just us, two souls quietly acknowledging the depth of their feelings. We spoke for hours, not in dramatic proclamations, but in shared reflections. About our fears, our hesitations, the way life had shaped us differently yet led us to this same small corner of connection. She listened as intently as she had that very first day, her gaze steady, her presence grounding me while simultaneously stirring a warmth I couldn't name. When the evening drew to a close, we stood together, lingering near the doorway. A small, deliberate touch, her hand resting lightly against my arm, conveyed more than words ever could. It was reassurance, acknowledgement, and a promise all at once. As I walked home, the cool night air filled my lungs, and I realized something profound. The lesson I came to learn had become irrelevant. What mattered now was this connection, this tender, delicate bond, and the unspoken trust we had built in the quiet spaces between words and gestures. In the weeks that followed our quiet confessions, everything between us seemed lighter, yet more profound. The weight of unspoken tension had given way to a gentle rhythm, a comfortable intimacy that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. The lessons still continued, but now they existed alongside a deeper awareness, a shared space of connection that neither of us needed to name constantly. One afternoon, we walked through a nearby park, the golden light of late afternoon filtering through the trees. Leaves rustled softly in the breeze, brushing against our shoulders as we walked side by side. Our conversation was easy, filled with small jokes, teasing remarks, and quiet laughter that made my chest feel warm in a way nothing else had. At one point, she reached out to steady me on a slippery patch of wet leaves, her fingers brushing mine ever so lightly. It was a touch so simple, so natural, yet it carried the weight of all the moments we had shared leading up to this. Later, we sat at a small café, the rich aroma of coffee surrounding us. She laughed at a story I recounted, and I felt the steady thrum of happiness in her presence. She leaned slightly closer across the table, her arm occasionally brushing mine, her smile soft yet deliberate. Every touch, every glance, felt deliberate in its gentleness, not urgent, not overwhelming, but grounding and reassuring. The world outside seemed distant, as if we had created a small, private bubble where time moved differently, marked by subtle warmth rather than dramatic declarations. Even in small gestures, intimacy flourished. Hesitation. I would hold the door open for her, and she would smile, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. When we shared a walk home under the setting sun, our hands occasionally touched, fingers brushing in casual acknowledgement of the bond we had carefully nurtured. No words were needed to understand the significance. It was all in the rhythm of shared presence, the quiet comfort of being together. We began noticing the small details that made each other feel seen. The way she hummed softly while brewing tea, or how she would glance at me during a lesson to see if I understood more than just the subject. I learned to cherish those moments, to recognize that this slow, patient intimacy was far richer than any sudden confession or dramatic display of affection. There was a beauty in the ordinary, a warmth in shared smiles, a thrill in simple closeness, and a deepening trust that allowed both of us to let our guards down entirely. By the end of the day, as we parted, she touched my forearm lightly, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. I watched her walk away, feeling a quiet joy that was different from infatuation or desire. It was the contentment of having someone notice you, understand you, and walk alongside you in life's small, unremarkable moments. It was gentle, it was tender, and it was ours. The weeks turned into months, and our connection deepened in quiet, unassuming ways. Each shared glance, each brush of fingers, had accumulated into a bond that felt effortless and enduring. We no longer needed words to articulate what had begun so delicately. It was understood in the rhythm of our presence, in the shared silences that spoke more than conversations ever could. One evening, after a long class, we found ourselves alone in the studio again. The city outside hummed softly through the windows, but inside, there was only the calm warmth of her presence. She was rearranging a few things on the desk, and I lingered near the doorway, savoring the familiar scent of her perfume, the way the lamplight caught her hair. Something had shifted over time. The nervous anticipation that had once fluttered in my chest had settled into a quiet certainty. I knew that whatever we shared was real, mutual, and lasting. She looked up from her work and caught my gaze. In that instant, the world seemed to pause. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a serene acknowledgement that our journey had led us here, to a space of trust, comfort, and tender intimacy. I stepped closer, and as our shoulders brushed, it felt neither sudden nor startling. It felt inevitable. Her hand rested lightly on mine, and I held it gently, letting the warmth between us convey everything words could not. We spoke softly, exchanging reflections on the months we had spent together. There were no grand confessions or dramatic declarations, only honesty, mutual respect, and a quiet joy in having discovered someone who truly saw us. She laughed softly at a small joke I made, and I caught the faint blush coloring her cheeks. My thumb brushed the back of her hand, and she didn't pull away, she simply let it linger, a shared understanding in that brief contact. As the evening light dimmed, we walked out together, side by side. The city streets were bathed in a gentle glow from the streetlights, and every step felt familiar, comforting, and meaningful. We paused under a tree, and I found myself brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that reflected everything we had come to share. Our hands intertwined naturally, effortlessly, as if they had always been meant to fit together. In that moment, I realized the truth that had been forming slowly in my heart. The lesson I had come to learn was no longer about anything tangible. It had become about her, about us, about the subtle, unspoken intimacy that grew through attention, trust, and patience. The age gap, the differences in our lives, felt insignificant compared to the bond we had cultivated. We stood there for a while, fingers entwined, cheeks brushing lightly, hearts beating quietly in sync. The anticipation, the hesitation, the longing, all had transformed into something steady, warm, and profoundly satisfying. And as we walked forward together into the soft glow of the night, I understood that the connection we had nurtured was not fleeting. It was a slow-burning, enduring flame that would continue to grow with every shared glance, every gentle touch, and every quiet moment of understanding.